Hi, everybody. Welcome, and thank you all for joining us. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Arwa Damon. I am a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council, and I also worked at CNN as a senior international correspondent for 17 plus years, focusing mostly on the Middle East, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Egypt, you name it. I'm also the founder and the president of the charity Inara that focuses on treating conflict, war, and instability impacted children medically and with mental health as well. And I've spent the most of the last 3 months in the earthquake zone, both in Turkey and Syria with Inara. And I have to say, I know war very, very well. And a lot of people have compared what they've seen there physically to a war zone. And that is correct. War most certainly can wreak the same or similar type of destruction that we are seeing across both Turkey and Syria. But there's something that's very different about what happened there and what happens in war. And that is that what happened in the earthquake was so instantaneous. War does not do that in a minute and a half. War does not displace or kill, generally speaking, that many people across such a vast stretch of land in that short of a time span. So I want to thank you all for joining us for this very important conversation, because whilst both the Turkish and the Syrian populations have been gravely, gravely impacted, the situation that Syrian refugees in Turkey find themselves in is most definitely quite unique. A little bit of housekeeping. We'll be getting to questions at about 3 p.m., so feel free to drop them into the comments. You can address them generally or to one specific person. And to introduce you to our panelists, I'm joined by Ambassador Daniel Speckard, who's the CEO of Chorus International, this amazing NGO that's doing relief work around the world and is also doing relief work in Turkey. He's formerly a U.S. ambassador. He led the reconstruction effort in Iraq and served as a senior official at NATO. We're also joined by Haya Atassi, who is the Media and Communications Manager for the Syrian Association for Citizens' Dignity, and has been working in advocacy for Syrian refugees for 8 years, and that is a tough job, to say the least. She spends a lot of her time traveling between Turkey and Lebanon. To kick us off, I would like to turn this over now to Ambassador Speckard for his opening remarks. Ambassador.
Thank you, Arwa, and it's a pleasure to be here. This is really an important topic because it's one of those things that, while it got a lot of attention in the first month, it's now starting to wane, and yet the problems are actually still very, very serious and growing for literally millions of people in southern Turkey. As you mentioned, it's notable what a significant part of that population that was affected was Syrians. This is a group that had already fled war about 8 or 9 years ago, coming across to find safety, and yet now they have been, as a result of this earthquake, their families have had many casualties, deaths, and their livelihoods have been completely disrupted. I was there last month, and I think that's what stood out for me is how these families had struggled so hard to get on their feet on the ground. They had integrated fairly well into the local communities. They were having local jobs and everything else, and now the families were actually broken apart with all the deaths and destructions. They had no place to live. There's no employment. One other thing that struck me is in a lot of the humanitarian assistance work that we do, the starting point oftentimes is cash assistance, right? It's been shown to be one of the most effective ways to get families back on their feet and actually support the local economy while you're doing that. There is no local economy. I don't think many of our viewers maybe understand the breadth of that destruction. There are no stores. There are no pharmacies. There are no health clinics. There is nothing. There's no place to get a job. And of course, there's also the issues of water, electricity, and services for the infrastructure there as well. So the breadth of this devastation in terms of on the local economy as well also makes a difference in the context that this isn't something where we just pour in a bunch of humanitarian assistance and within 3 to 6 months, it's all back on its feet. We do know that a lot of the Turkish population, many of them fled to other cities, other regions because they had relatives, friends, or were able to double up with other families. For the Syrian refugees, that wasn't possible. So again, you see a highly impacted community there. Last thing I'll mention is the challenges of age, right? You have kind of two ends of this. First, I met a lot of very elderly people who have a particularly challenge in these kinds of situations. But it's actually two women who are in their 90s. Of course, with no pharmacies and the infrastructure for the health system not working well, you can imagine anybody, that's having any chronic illnesses or challenges is particularly challenged in these kind of situations, as well as those who face disabilities or other kinds of regular challenges. And the second thing is the children. About 4 million children have been affected by this, school-age children, by this earthquake. And of course, getting them supported in their education as they continue, as well as the psychological trauma that they've all faced, is a big challenge. What we saw in the 10 cities that we're working in is that heroic efforts by teachers from all over Turkey are coming to volunteer for a couple of weeks at a time. But imagine trying to support an education of your kids where you're getting a different teacher every 2 to 3 weeks, and you're doing it in a tent with all classes together and so forth. So it's just an untenable situation right now for many of these families.
Yeah, it really is. And when we talk about the psychological trauma on children, you have these two populations there, right? You have the Turkish population, and they're experiencing this level of fear, this horrible lesson of home no longer being safe for the first time, and they're having to cope with that. And then we look at the Syrian children that have been impacted by this. And oftentimes, many of them, they've already learned that lesson when they fled war. They already learned that home wasn't safe. They were already on the road. And then finally, they saw their parents build them that sense of safety and security again, only to have it taken away. And that has really significantly compounded the trauma amongst Syrian children as well. Thank you. We'll be going quite in more detail into a number of the points that you mentioned, Ambassador. Haya, over to you, please, for your opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Arwa, and thank you for having me today. And thank you, Ambassador, for the great brief. I don't believe I need to talk more about the impact of the earthquake, but I would like to shed the light more on a very dangerous issue that has been going on before the earthquake hit, which is the forced return of displaced Syrians. Not only the Syrians who are living in Turkey, but in general, the refugees also who are living in Europe and all of that. And we at the Syrian Association for Citizens' Dignity have been advocating for years for the establishment of a safe environment that provides a safe return for Syrians. Now, we know that there are around 1.75 million Syrians who are living in southern Turkey and alone, and they were severely hit by, severely affected by what happened in the earthquake. And around 40,000 of these, of the Syrians who were affected in southern Turkey were forced to return back to the rebel-held areas in northern Syria. And this was for us a very alarming issue, and it's very concerning for us because it's very dangerous that Syrians are being put in a situation where they are being forced to return to conditions which are not safe enough for them. We definitely understand the gravity of the situation on the ground, and we understand that the difficulties that the Turkish government has been facing in its response to the earthquake. However, we at the association believe that it's very important to always shed light on the gravity and the danger of Syrians who already fled Syria due to the lack of safety and security, and they sought refuge in Turkey and they built their lives there. And now, due to the earthquake, which is a situation out of the control of everyone, are being forced into returning into a quite unsafe situation in Syria. I believe we're going to talk about this furthermore.
Yes, thank you so much. Ambassador, I wanted to ask you, you've given us quite the overview of, what the situation is in terms of, access to, or the impossibility of access to medicines for the elderly, those who are needing it, education for, so many children that are out of school right now, and trying to sort of build that sense of routine for a child so they can at least begin to feel at least the outlines of, stability, if one can even begin to say that. We also know that there are signs of trauma amongst both the child and the adult population that aren't necessarily openly visible. Things like, children have started bedwetting again, adults are unable to sleep. Some of them until 4:17 a.m., which is the exact time that the earthquake struck, and it's only after that they're actually able to close their eyes for a little bit. So many of these different sorts of issues to begin to tackle. I mean, from your experience, how would you even begin to address something of this magnitude?
Right. Well, I think the way the Turkish government and the international community is spot on in the sense that you first have to deal with basic human needs in these kinds of situations. And so they've done a pretty good job of trying to make sure everybody's in some sort of shelter and feeding. Right. We didn't see when I was there a month ago a lot of malnutrition, people going hungry, and the challenges of not getting enough food. Although they're not going on lots of meals a day, but everybody's getting at least one good meal a day. And they're in tents. The trouble, of course, is these tents is that it's going to get very, very hot in southern Turkey very soon. Some of the tents, I was talking to the families, they have 6 to 8 people in some of these tents. It's not a sustainable place to live. The tent cities themselves, which there are, I think something like 600 of them in the country now, 600,000 tents kind of thing. This is not a sustainable kind of situation. One of the cities I visited, the tent cities, had 1,200 people in it and 8 toilets and 2 showers, right? And you had to walk to get your water to a central location. So it's not a sustainable thing. It also then you start leading to potential problems for health challenges as well. So what the international community and the government are focusing on is moving into the WASH area, that's water, health, and sanitation, to make sure you kind of deal with that issue and the challenges that's going to be of the heat and the living conditions. So they're trying to move as many of these people out of tents into containers, which is short-term prefab kind of simple, more sturdy housing as we head into the summer. Government would like to do much bigger construction, and I think that's where the international community needs to be turning attention, which is what's the plan here for actually getting beyond this humanitarian short-term response to help Turkey support this. And the international community has a big role to play to make sure that when we do this, we're not forgetting the Syrian refugees in that process. But that requires a lot of work. They would like, I think, government has said they want to do 600,000 new permanent residences in apartments and so forth, and 300,000 of those in 1 year. The challenge, of course, is part of the problem was many of these buildings weren't built well to begin with, right? Mm-hmm. And so you don't want to rush in an earthquake zone to build something that people aren't going to feel safe in. You mentioned that, you and I were talking ahead of time. Many people have apartments that they could be living in and aren't going back because they're in high rises and they don't trust the construction. So this is a longer term process, and I think what we need to be turning our attention to is the reconstruction and recovery effort that's much longer than the short term needs.
And I'm sure you know as well as many of us that unfortunately long-term planning is not necessarily the forte when it comes to dealing with these kinds of disasters. But I wanted to sort of shift it a little bit in terms of the specific impact on the Syrian population in Turkey that you observed. I know from my own experiences down there, when we would see a lot of the informal settlements that were springing up, the vast majority of them were Syrian settlements. And that was for a number of reasons, but we also were hearing a lot of stories and people sharing their own experiences in terms of how they felt like they were being discriminated against. In the early days of the earthquake, I had a number of my friends actually who were down there who were Syrian saying that, they would go into restaurants to try to use the bathroom and they would be told, no, no Syrians are allowed here. And there was quite a bit of sort of tension that was really growing between the Syrian and the Turkish population, or at least the Turkish population and the non-Turkish, the refugee population. What were your observations in terms of that, and how potentially dangerous do you think that is for the survival of Syrian refugees in Turkey?
Yeah, I think it's a very worrying trend. Because obviously it's not just a short-term issue, it's a longer-term issue. This has been something that's kind of been in play for a while. The Turkish government deserves a lot of credit for hosting so many millions, I think roughly 3.5 million refugees in Turkey. But at the same time, what you see in the local populations is a lot of that stress was already there before in terms of the local allocation of resources towards the refugees compared to the local communities. And now when you have a catastrophe like this, it just gets heightened, right? And these are the kind of situations where you really do have to worry and put a lot of work and effort into community building and the socioeconomic work related to building bridges between these communities, right? And I think part of the key there is we've done this in Lebanon, where we actually have projects related to communities with Syrian refugees, where you try to find that win-win, right? Where Syrian refugees actually start supporting the local economy, and you start highlighting that through a lot of conversations and discussions at the community level amongst the groups. In this case, it has to do with reconstruction, right? They cannot build all of these infrastructure that they need to rebuild without a lot of labor. And Syrian refugees are there, and actually they need the work and they need the employment. So there has to be a significant effort to try to make sure people are actually working hard to bridge this divide that's going to be there. And to be frank, I don't expect that's happening right now. We're in a political season. In terms of what I saw, the only last thing I can say is I didn't see the kind of cases you were talking about. What I did see is we're working there on the shelter issue. The shelters we were working with, tents with our local Turkish partners, those were Syrians were in the tents. The prefab container housing, which is not great, but it's much better than a tent. Those were going to be occupied by Turkish displaced people, right? And so there's definitely still a hierarchy there of how the resources are being allocated. I don't want to criticize anybody here, and most governments are going to take care of their citizens first, but then I think the criticism is going to have to go on the international community. The rest of us are going to have to step up if we want to make sure there's that parity there, and not expect already a very strained Turkish government on the economic side and in a political season to pick that all up.
Yeah, very fair point. Definitely need more support from the international community, although unfortunately, as we all well know, when it comes to Syria, that sort of support that Syria has always needed has been sorely and sadly lacking. Haya, how was your experience in those first few days of the earthquake in terms of, I'm sure you were talking to a lot of people on the ground, a lot of Syrians within the community about what the initial days right after the earthquake were like for them. What kind of things did you hear from them? Can you share some of those stories?
Of course, we were in touch with a lot of the Syrian people on the ground. I think that it's not very we're not in a position to generalize in general how the Syrians in Turkey were treated after the earthquake. There were instances where the Syrian people and the Turkish people were very helpful to each other and very cooperative with each other, and there were instances where Syrians faced heavy discrimination, like the ambassador was discussing a while ago. So from my personal experience, I've known families where the entire family died. I know people where there was an aid worker who was in Idlib helping the people under the rubble, and he lost his entire family under the rubble in Hatay. So really, it was devastating for us because it was extremely traumatizing, the fact that these people ran away from bombs and from shelling and from war, technically, to be faced by a natural disaster, which was not any less devastating for them. In terms of the provision of aid by the Turkish government, in general, to be fair, I think the Turkish government tried their best. However, the gravity of the earthquake and the fact that it was distributed on more than 11 districts in the north made it extremely difficult for the Turkish government to respond to their own population, let alone the Syrian population. And I want to shed light on a very important issue, the lack of international response to Syrians in northwest Syria, because throughout the past years, the main, let's say, state or the main source of aid to northwest Syria was coming through Turkey. And then the fact that Turkey was heavily affected by the earthquake and the roads were heavily affected and the borders were not functioning properly really had its toll on the people in northwest Syria as well. And that's when we realized the lack of political decision on behalf of the international institutions, and on top of it, the UN, to actually provide a proper emergency response aid to the Syrians in northwest Syria and the Syrians in southern Syria as well.
Yeah, and for those who are listening in who might not know all of the inner workings of, the cross-border mechanisms, could you just give us a brief overview on exactly how it is that cross-border works between Turkey and specifically northwest Syria?
Sure. So by the time that the earthquake happened, there was only one border crossing between Turkey and Syria that was actually operating under a mandate by from the United Nations Security Council. Although legally speaking, the United Nations has all the legal basis to deliver aid through these border crossings without having to go to the United Nations Security Council. But unfortunately, there seems to be a decision by the UN to politicize the aid, and therefore they were using only one border crossing between Turkey and Syria. This border crossing was heavily affected by the earthquake, first because of the roads, so it took like 1 or 2 days for the roads to be fixed, and second of all, because technically there were no trucks that were actually entering from Turkey into Syria, specifically UN trucks. They waited almost a week. The United Nations waited almost a week to get let's say the green light, or to get a mandate from the Syrian regime to allow for the aid to enter through cross border. There were attempts to actually make the aid enter through the cross line, which means aid coming through the areas under the control of the Syrian regime into the areas under the control of the rebels. But the de facto authorities in the rebel-held areas refused that aid comes through the regime because, of course, it has a lot of political impacts. First and foremost, the aid will be manipulated by the Syrian regime. So it was extremely shameful, and we've written about it a lot, how the United Nations waited for more than a week at the time when they did not need such a mandate, and they did not need any permission from the Syrian regime to deliver any sorts of aid. And I would like to mention that there were, I think on the day 3 or 4 or something, there were like a couple trucks which entered northwest Syria, but not as part of emergency aid after the earthquake. It was part of a project that was already operating before the earthquake happened.
And I think that's something that's a bit important to highlight, because we've always had this issue of the politicization of aid when it comes to Syria, whether it's on the Security Council, whether it's the way that, it gets handled. It's often quite weaponized, not just within the Syria context, in other contexts as well. But Ambassador, I'd be quite interested to get your thoughts on this, and what's at risk when we keep on politicizing humanitarian aid to Syria's most in need.
Well, I think there's kind of two things. Obviously, there's the moral challenge of this when you're talking about people who are literally at the edge of survival and have been hit now with this kind of earthquake when they were already just trying to survive. I mean, that's kind of one of the things that you have to think about with displaced populations, right? Regular populations in countries sometimes have small amounts of savings, they have some assets, they have cars, they have other kinds of things maybe, and they figure out how to use whatever little assets they have to go through another 6 to 12 months. But when you're dealing with displaced populations, they in particular are already at the very edge, right? So when you use humanitarian assistance in a political context like that, and use it as a leverage tool, you're talking about people's lives. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of these people's lives are children, right? So I think it's unconscionable to kind of think of it that way. Same time, the politics is always there, right? We got to be realistic. I can't paint a broad brush and make all of these things go away. One of the things that Haya mentioned, but she captured a lot of it. One piece that also plays very big into this is the Kurdish issue for Turkey, right? And so in Syria, there are significant Kurdish populations, and they view that as sometimes a safe haven for their nervousness about their issue as it relates to Kurdish extremism in their country. And so this is also captured in that dynamic. And then you, of course, have the Russians and the Americans and the Gulf states, everybody all playing in this little neighborhood right next door to Turkey, along with some fairly significant extremist groups. I wish my first answer is the right answer. That's the answer we should all be wanting. The reality is it is complicated. And I think what that requires then is an approach that is, it's not enough for us just to say, if these people are suffering, you got to do the right thing. We have to also say we need diplomats in there resolving these political tensions and problems. We need the focus and attention of the international community, including the United Nations, including the United States, including the European Union, to understand that this may not be your highest priority today, but people are dying and we need your political engagement to unravel some of the political challenges to provide the space for humanitarian assistance to occur.
Well, in some ways, we also need to revamp the entire way that the whole humanitarian prism sort of views the Syria crisis, given that every single year we're dealing with winterization campaigns and pleas that continue to go unfunded when it comes specifically to Syria itself. Haya, you'd mentioned the forced return of Syrians into northwest Syria from Turkey. It's been quite unspeakably difficult for Syrians, obviously, because many of them, they had family members across both sides of the border. Some people lost family members inside Syria, but they were stuck in Turkey and they couldn't travel back across. Syrians who died in Turkey, their loved ones, their family members wanted to bury them inside Syria. Sometimes they weren't able to go across with them. And just to give a bit of background to our listeners on the situation. So normally, and correct me if I'm wrong, Syrians who have official status inside Turkey, who have residency inside Turkey, or refugee status, they can only travel back into Syria with specific permissions from the Turkish government. And if they travel back into Syria without getting permission, then they are no longer permitted to return back to Turkey. However, Turkey lifted this after the earthquake, allowing Syrians a 3-month grace period to be able to basically go back home. So what I want to understand a bit more from you is this forced return that you're speaking about happening outside of this entire framework, or are we seeing some sort of manipulation of events on the ground? Could you go into a bit more detail?
So in fact, what happened is that it's similar to what the ambassador explained a while ago. There was actually a shelter crisis in Turkey and after the earthquake, and it was difficult to shelter Syrians and Turks alike. And we do understand that the challenge that the Turkish government was facing and that it had to prioritize the Turkish people. So in that case, many Syrians found themselves forced to go back to rebel-held areas and specifically to Idlib and so on, because they did not have shelter. However, we warned that the fact that people became shelterless should not be used as an excuse or as a de facto reason to allow for their return. It is the responsibility of the international community to protect those Syrian refugees against such a premature and unsafe return, because the situation in northern Syria is not safe for the return of displaced Syrians. And the fact that a natural disaster hit Turkey should not act as a catalyst for such unsafe and premature return. And we also wanted to warn that we didn't want because the United Nations have been for quite a while advocating or talking about area-based returns and pilot projects for the return of displaced Syrians, specifically in areas around Damascus. And we didn't want this return to act as a sort of a pilot project for the return of Syrians. And this is why we advocated that the assistance and aid for displaced Syrians should be provided to them in their current locations, in the locations where they are actually living, in order to protect them. It is very similar to this, quite similar to the situation of Syrian refugees in Lebanon months ago, when they were facing a lot of discrimination and a lot of problems. They were forced into, and specifically after the economic crisis hit Lebanon, many of them were actually forced into a return to Syria. But at that time, they returned to areas under the regime control, and there were a lot of reports of these people being detained and they killed under torture. And we warned against such forced and premature return. So what I want to say here is that sometimes forced return is not by a country forcing refugees to return. Sometimes the refugees are put in situation and circumstances that force them into such return. And this happened after the earthquake. And this is why we called upon all the donor countries and the international institutions to provide the necessary aid for the Syrian refugees in Turkey, and not to leave the burden on the Turkish government by itself, in order to protect those Syrians from such return to northern Syria.
Yeah, very fair points. So if we're going to start talking about, the international community and the need for the international community to step up and do more, Ambassador, back to you. What would your recommendations be if you kind of had that magic ability to shifts the international community's response towards what you believe it should be? And how do you, realistically speaking, argue that, given that we know very well that a lot of the countries that sort of hold the cards and the purse strings are hyper-focused on Ukraine right now?
Yeah, this is the challenge that we're facing, which is with Ukraine sucking up so much of the attention, understandably, but um, still keeping people's eyes from the focus on this problem. I guess the argument I would be making in the halls of power would be, this is a much bigger problem if you don't deal with it now, right? I mean, you're talking about 1.7 million refugees here. They're keeping them in conditions that are really going to be intolerable is a boiling pot, right? And we've seen in the past what happens where they become hotbeds for extremism, violence, and other kinds of things, and mass migrations, right? They're not going to sit there forever if those kind of numbers, and they will go on the move if the international community doesn't do something. And so I would try to make those kind of arguments. There are a lot of tools as well, besides just the straight humanitarian assistance. The World Bank and international development banks can come to support. I understand they're looking at grants in Syria and loans in Turkey, but it's important then that those institutions look at the infrastructure that needs to be rebuilt and keeps an eye on the Syrian refugee part of that, as I mentioned earlier. So there can be resources that come into this that doesn't come straight out of Congress's pockets or somebody else's to address these issues. It needs attention. It needs focus, right? So I would be asking for a special envoy or a special high-level representative here in the U.S. and Europe to make sure the attention stays on this, that it gets on the agenda, G7 and G20 kinds of meetings, gets on the agenda of EU meetings. We have to remember this is an important NATO country, right? I mean, yes, we have lots of challenges, lots of problems, but from a strategic point of view, there is nothing good about this problem not being addressed that's going to come out of it. And it's going to destabilize a region that's already a little bit unstable and very sensitive in the context of the challenges that the United States and Europe are playing with Russia.
Yeah, very true. Very true. Haya, you've been advocating for Syrian refugees for years. And I have to say, like, that must be so emotionally intense, especially given for some reason how hard it has been to always constantly try to draw attention to Syria and to the plight of Syrians. What would you do if you had the international community's ear?
I think that the issue of the return of displaced Syrians is actually very intrinsic to any political solution to Syria. So since the beginning of our work at the Syrian Association for Citizens' Dignity, we've been arguing that the issue of the return of displaced Syrians is not a humanitarian issue, it's a political issue in its nature. And no talks for the future of Syria, and there are no talks on any stability or peace of Syria can happen unless displaced Syrians have a safe environment to return to. And last year in November, we held a conference in Geneva, and we invited key states, and we invited diplomats, and we invited even the United Nations were there. And we presented to them a roadmap to a safe environment in Syria, where we set out a technical paper with what are the steps that should happen before the return of the displaced Syrians, during their return and after their return, to ensure and to secure that there is a safe environment in Syria for the return of displaced Syrians. Now we are talking about the 1.7 million in southern Turkey and the 4 million in Idlib, but in fact we have 13 million displaced Syrians in Turkey, in Europe, in the United States, and in the Middle East, and within Syria itself, we have people who were internally displaced. And therefore, the issue of the return of displaced Syrians, I mean, the earthquake must act as a wake-up call for us. It must act as and it must be a catalyst to the importance of addressing the issue of displaced Syrians and treating it as a political issue in its nature, not just as a humanitarian issue and just provide people with only food to eat and a tent to live under. We actually need the international community, first of all, to end the manipulation of aid by the Syrian regime. We also issued a report discussing how the Syrian regime weaponizes aid. We've written a lot on how the United Nations, unfortunately, is a complicit with the Syrian regime in providing aid, and they are being manipulated. They are aware of the manipulation of the Syrian regime of the aid, and there should be a support and also to end the control, the cross-border resolution, the cross-border mechanism, which is being used by Russia to blackmail the international community at the Security Council. When we know that there is a legal basis where we can go to the United Nations General Assembly and we can get a mandate, and aid can be delivered into all areas across Syria without the need for Russia to blackmail and to have the upper hand in this issue. So there are actually steps that can be taken by the international community. First of all, to protect aid from being politicized. Second of all, to start taking concrete steps into securing a safe environment for displaced Syrians, while at the same time providing them with aid in the locations which they are currently located in order to prevent them from and to protect them from any unsafe return.
And just so people who may not be aware understand, why is it? Because, a lot of individuals who are sort of not really paying attention to what's happening inside Syria, or those who are right now, will say things like, well, the fighting isn't as bad as it used to be. Why aren't people going back home? Why is it still unsafe for them?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very important question. It's not about the fighting. It's about the lack of safety and security. It's about the non-stop detentions, death under torture. It's about the lack of the basic standards of life. The people in Syria, they did not flee from the fighting per se. They fled from the practices of the Syrian regime. And as long as this regime is still in control and it's still ruling its areas, it is not possible for the people to return. There are countless reports, by the way, by Human Rights Watch, by Amnesty International, that are documenting what happens to Syrian returnees. Every Syrian returnee is a potential detainee. Therefore, we cannot ask, and we also issued a report where we indicated what are the top 5 conditions that Syrians want to see before they return back to Syria. And one of these conditions was the release of the detainees. Imagine you have a brother or a sister or a mother or a relative who is detained. Would you feel safe to go back to Syria? Of course not. So there are conditions that have to be put, or that have to be discussed or part of any negotiations before we talk about the constitutional committee, before we talk about the step for step. There are basic prerequisites that should exist for Syrians to even consider returning back to Syria. That's when it comes to areas under the control of the regime. As to the areas that are under the control of the rebels, it's not a safe area. I mean, we have all seen that after a few days after the earthquake, the regime was shelling these areas. It was bombing these areas. So these areas are not safe. These areas do not have one authority that's controlling them. So I don't know what kind of Syria people can return back to now in light of all of these conditions.
Yeah,
just to add Arwa to that, it's not a simple thing just to say go home as if there's just a nice little house waiting with the porch light on, right? The reality is, after years of war and now the earthquake also devastated some wide swaths of Syria as well, that it's not like there's places. So for the international community, yes, it's an issue of reconstruction, humanitarian assistance, and development, but it's not like it's a simple solution to say just go home, because there's not a lot waiting for many of these displaced populations.
Absolutely. And, this is what I say when I keep getting asked the question is, if you look at who was displaced inside Idlib, let's just take Idlib as an example, right? I remember when the first IDPs showed up there in 2011 from just Shurur, and they set up the first tents underneath the olive trees. And then, the population started coming from all these areas. And, you tell people, look, if someone has been living in a tent for 7 years, and in theory, let's say their neighborhood right now is not being bombed, and they're still choosing not to go back home and live in these horrible conditions where children are born who don't even know what a wall is, that means that the fear factor that is keeping them from going home is so great that they're willing to subject themselves and their kids to this, way of life. And I just feel as if that message oftentimes, it gets lost in a lot of the sort of noise that surrounds the whole Syria conversation. And to bring it back, to what we can and should be doing now. I mean, Ambassador, what is at risk here? If we, the bigger we, the international community, the whoever it may be, if we fail to adequately address the situation for Syrian refugees inside Turkey, and also all of these issues that Haya has brought up.
What's at risk is really the lives of hundreds of thousands of people, a whole generation that if you miss the education of these young kids, will not get educated, won't have opportunities to kind of develop and resettle and be productive members of societies in terms of contributing to a country's growth. But even more importantly, on this internationally, it's the security issue as it relates to this. As I mentioned earlier, you can't have roughly 2 million people kept in impossible conditions for years and years and not expect that to start having ripple effects throughout the region. This is a sensitive region, right? I mean, we know this part of the world. You know it better than anybody, Arwa. But it's not like it's going to be contained in southern Turkey or northern Syria, right? It spills over into these other countries, and then those other countries start having serious international and political consequences for international security, as well as also oftentimes economics, right? This is playing into Turkish politics, right? Turkey sits at the crossroads between Europe and Asia, right? It controls the Bosphorus, right? It has enormous influence, and we need a stable, growing, prosperous country that is managing well this refugee situation and allowing to support these communities until they can return home. And we need to be on top of Syria. We can't just give up. We can't just throw up our hands and say, I'm sorry, we tried, now it's boring. We've been trying to do this too long. Right? It's not acceptable.
Why do you think it's always been so hard to get attention onto what's happening in Syria?
Well, I'm probably the wrong person because I was connected to Iraq and not in the cleanup, right? Part of it, spent 2 years of my life in Baghdad trying to help do recovery and reconstruction there. But I think after the exhaustion of the United States over Iraq, that when this spilled over into Syria, initially there were attempts to try to manage it, but then as the Russians got involved, Assad proved much stronger than anticipated in his ability to hold on and so forth, that they kind of wore the United States out in that sense. Europe, on the other hand, is much closer, so it's felt the push of migration flows that have been enormous as a result of this and historic. So they have a much bigger stake here. But once Russia became involved in it, it got very complicated very quickly and not easy to fix because it became a proxy for an international competition.
Yeah, but I mean, Haya, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too. I mean, it's not just about sort of the lack of political willpower to do anything. It's also been this ongoing struggle. I mean, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but if memory serves me right, there has not been a single appeal for Syria since it all started back in 2011 that has actually been fully funded. Like, trying to get money and funding for humanitarian activities in Syria or relating to Syrians has literally been trying to, claw the bottom of a concrete, well or something, and just trying to get little flakes underneath your fingers so that you can actually do something.
I really remember back in 2014 how the Syrian regime was to be honest, on the verge of collapsing, and it lost control over most of its territory. And it was the Russian, I call it invasion or interference, whatever we want to name it. It really saved the regime. And I think at that point, the conflict became more of an of Russia versus what do you want to call it, Europe, this the United States. I don't know. It's actually a problem in the whole system when you have an entire nation, and when you have people who are dying, and when you have people who are in a dire humanitarian situation, and then providing aid to these people has to be vetoed at the United Nations Security Council. That's actually a problem. That's where politics came in. Syria was not a lot. I think at some point when we first started, Syria was about people calling for their freedom, people calling for their justice, and that's why the whole world stood by the Syrian people. But then when it became more of a proxy war, and then Russia interfered, and then Iran interfered, and then Turkey also had its troops on the ground, it became quite complicated. And I think, just like the ambassador mentioned, the United Nations, the international community is tired, and they don't want to really bother with. I don't know who actually. It's a question to ask. Who are they leaving Syria to? Yeah, and who is going to sort it out? I don't know, but they have to, because if they don't, just like was mentioned a while ago, the waves of migration will never end, and then we have 13 more. Do you have any idea how the number of people who are trying to leave Syria now? People who are living in areas under the regime control. It's impossible for the situation to continue the way it is. So at some point, a certain a transition has to happen, and a solution has to be found. But I don't know what they're waiting to agree on.
Yeah, I mean, and also, as we know very well, when you trap a population and you deny it education and you deny it opportunity, you end up with people who are understandably illiterate,
Of course,
or
that's
that
dangerous.
makes them very, very vulnerable to certain actors in the area.
We have children who don't know what a home means. Can you
Yeah.
imagine? We have today children who are 12 years old, 11 years old. They don't know what it means to live under a roof. It's
Yeah,
quite dangerous. It's very dangerous.
yeah, I remember it was a few years back when I was in Idlib. It was when the fighting was still happening and the bombings were still happening. And I met a girl who had been injured when a bomb went off when she was in her home. She was about 12 years old at the time. And she was 3 when it all started, about 5 years old when they initially fled. And I remember I asked her, what do you dream about for the future? And she kind of looked at me with this blank stare. And then I had a moment and I said, wait, like, do you dream about the future? And she said, no. And that was just so sad and shocking to a certain degree that, these children have been deprived of so much that they don't even know how to dream of a future without war, because they have absolutely, no idea what that looks like. And now we have very many of these very same children again who are being left in these especially vulnerable situations in this post-earthquake era that are even more at risk than they were before. Ambassador, what are your sort of, I guess, closing thoughts, or, things that you really would want, those listening to this to sort of take home with them?
I think just this is a good way to kind of wrap this up in terms of what you're talking about, which is this is not something you can just ignore and it's going to go away, right? It's going to have long-term consequences, and the long-term consequences are likely to spill over into the international community. But at the root of this is people. These are human beings, right? And what you've been describing in a very powerful way, Arwa, and Hatapaya, is these are children, right? And they're not getting educated. But it's not just that. You mentioned earlier the psychological trauma that has been inflicted on these children is enormous. And we know from our own countries that has long-term implications for the health of a country, community implications, and the ability for people to be productive citizens in the international community and in their countries, right? So this requires attention. First and foremost, if you can't pay attention to the bigger stuff, pay attention to the children, right? Because people do care about children. So let's keep holding up these children. We can get attention. This is a great thing. Appreciate the Atlantic Council for doing this. Attention needs to be drawn back to here. Ukraine is important, but this is a boiling pot that's about to boil over here in the coming years if we don't pay attention to it now.
Yeah, and I keep saying, like what we're seeing going to Ukraine is absolutely needed. The attention on Ukraine is absolutely needed. But what I somehow still cannot understand, despite all the years that I've been covering war and kind of working in this space, is why it is that one population has to continue to suffer at the expense of another. I mean, it's a conversation for another day, but I just, I don't understand that. Hi, what are your sort of closing thoughts? And also before you get started, just a reminder to everyone listening in, you can leave your comments in the chat, your questions in the chat section, and we'll be getting to those very shortly.
Just like I mentioned earlier, I think that what happened now with the earthquake should be an alarm, and it should be a wake-up call for the international community to understand the gravity and the seriousness of the crisis of the displaced Syrians who are not only in Turkey but dispersed all over the world. We cannot leave these generations. I mean, okay, the displaced Syrians, the Syrian refugees who are living in Europe and in Turkey and the United States and other countries, they, of course, they do have a decent life and they do enjoy a decent life. But what happened in northern Syria, I think history will never forget this, the way in which the international community did not respond. I don't want to say their poor response. I want to say how they did not respond to what happened to the earthquake and to a natural disaster. I mean, all these years, the argument has been that it's political, it's war, it's terrorism, it's I don't know what. But I mean, what is their argument when it comes to a natural disaster? How do you justify the fact that you did not provide these people with the minimum and the least help that they needed to save their lives? Because we all know that there are so many Syrians who died in northwest Syria because of the lack of immediate response. Honestly, my message today is not to the international community. My message today is to the Syrian communities and to the Syrian civil society that we should keep on demanding for our rights. We should keep on advocating for our rights. What happened in the earthquake, we should call for investigations against the UN bodies or against the UN institutions or whatever who were late or who did not respond to the earthquake. And on top of all of that, we are seeing now in the past few days the very surprising Arab normalization attempts with the Syrian regime. I think we should stand steadfast against this. No argument that no normalization with the Syrian regime can bring peace and prosperity to Syrian people. Only holding this regime accountable, only punishing the perpetrators, only working towards establishing a safe environment for Syrian people can actually help us and can actually provide the conditions that Syrians have to see for them to be able to return back. Otherwise, this conflict will have repercussions on Europe, on Turkey, on neighboring countries, and it will not, just like Ambassador mentioned a while ago, you cannot contain these people in this super small area. At the end of the day, it's going to explode, and I think that action has to be taken before it actually explodes.
Yeah, I keep and each time I go back, especially like to Idlib and these other areas, you see the space is just shrinking, and the population is growing, and it's completely untenable. Okay, so to everyone listening in, again, you can send us a couple of questions. I've got one here. How can the UNHCR's policies be revisited to distinguish between refugees of war and refugees of a natural crisis? I don't know which one of you wants to jump in on that one.
To say I don't have the technical expertise to understand the regulations for UNHCR in terms of the context of the question. What I can say is in the context of Syria, there is a lot of work to be done as it relates to that and to Turkey in the context of getting good, strong access to these communities and ensuring that we are able to support them. In the case of Syria, for instance, a lot of international NGOs find it very, very difficult to work there. not just because of the access of getting in and out and across the borders, but also because of restrictions related to banking and finance. Right? You can run afoul very quickly if you're working in neighboring countries who have strong restrictions on your if you have a bank account and you're spending money in Syria, you sometimes can lose your banking rights in other countries in the Middle East that INGOs are working in. You can run afoul of, if you're working in certain communities, of restrictions related to government's views on financing of terrorism, even though, of course, no INGO is focusing on terrorism, but just in the places you're working or ways you're working, you can run afoul of those. All sorts of government regulations and restrictions as it relates to Syria come into play. So sorry that I can't help you on the details of the question, the specific details on UNHCR, but I think the broader question is the right one, which is we do need to be making it easier for the international humanitarian and development community to want to be able to work in these areas and not have themselves stymied by so many legal restrictions.
Yeah, I agree with that, but I also want to add to what you're saying, is that there are ways for some of these organizations to actually be able to operate inside Syria. There's a number of, local partners that are there on the ground right now that, are growing in their efforts. There's a lot that, here's the interesting thing also, is there's a lot that can be locally sourced inside Syria. Like you want to get aid to Syrian refugees, IDPs that have been impacted by the earthquake. There's a lot that can be purchased inside Syria and distributed. The big challenge with the earthquake response wasn't just that stuff wasn't coming in, it was that inside there wasn't enough to get what was already there circulating to the population, which just compounded everything all together. I don't know, Haya, do you have any thoughts on that one?
So true.
What I want to say that I don't think we need to distinguish between a refugee of a natural disaster and a refugee of war, because at that point, just like you mentioned, it was possible for aid to be delivered, and there was no legal impediment to the delivery of aid. It was just that there was no decision, because aid in Syria is politicized. So even if we decide to find some article that says that refugees of war are a different definition than refugees of natural disasters, still no action would have been taken, because that was not the impediment to the provision of aid. It was more of a political decision. Of course, there were logistical difficulties, like Aaron mentioned, but at the end of the day, these can be sorted out. Planes were flying into Turkey with a lot of aid. Turkey did not impede the delivery of aid to people in northwest Syria. The borders were open, and there were, by the way, the local Syrian organizations, they were operating and they were bringing in aid, and they were buying from the warehouses what was there and all of that. So the mechanism was already there, but the United Nations did not want to support, or they did not want to actually provide the aid. I don't know if my point is well articulated.
I think that's actually a good point. I would validate it, Haya, that a lot of INGOs were working in northern Syria, less are working now because of the dynamics that played out politically, that the costs of working in northern Syria in terms of political costs for an international NGO, in terms of what they can do and not do, the risks, the legal risks, and so forth, all were tripled with some of the developments that Haya was talking about. So that can be reversed, right? That can be reversed. It's a political kind of dynamic that Haya is talking about, where there's a move towards a normalization of the regime, and then that makes it much more difficult for those who want to stay working in the north to have to kind of choose sides when you're trying just to be an independent, neutral actor as a humanitarian organization.
Yeah. And you kind of always have to choose, right? Like you're either going to work in regime held areas or in rebel held areas. You can't do both. Here's another question. What is the role of the media when it comes to highlighting the Syrian refugees' current struggle?
That one's for you, Arwa.
Yeah. Look, it's always been a constant battle, right? And it's like this with so many stories, it first happens, it's out there. I've always said that Syria was the most documented war of our time, with all of the social media videos that were coming out there, and all of the very brave activists inside Syria who were literally dying just to get a shot of a tank to be able to prove to the outside world that, you know what, yes, the Assad regime is actually firing on demonstrators. Yeah, I think the role of the media is absolutely essential. I think it is unfortunately part of the way that sort of the media cycle works, and that, networks and outlets lose interest in a story. I've always found that to be fundamentally wrong. Um, and I think, that's where we, as the media, because I am still in that space, I think that's where it becomes on us. The burden is on us to look for new ways to present what may seem to be an old story. And that's kind of, part of what I'm trying to do right now is just sort of take some of these themes that have been out there for a while that people aren't necessarily interested in and try to repackage them in a way that will generate interest. And this kind of sort of bleeds into the next question, which is social media in particular was a big driver behind donations. How can the message be tailored to reflect the dire reality on the ground? And I'll just start that one too. And I think the problem also, again, and this is with people's attention span in general, people are very interested in donating and giving. And in the first month donations, were, yes, they were great. It was incredible. It was amazing. But this goes back to how do we do long-term planning when we know that we're dealing with a short-term attention span? And Ambassador, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that one.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think we can do a lot better when it comes to the initial challenges and making sure we get enough use in social media. We're getting much better, of course. Social media is such a relatively new thing in terms of the last 10 years as opposed to something long. But we're starting to figure it out. But again, it's hard to keep social media going 3, 4, a year from now, southern Turkey, victims of this, it's not going to be the same as whatever that next disaster is. So that's why I really do think it's the role of the governments, international organizations, foundations, and others who see these, and the business is to try to change the world to make it a better place and address the humanitarian and development issues. There is a collective group of parts of governments, international organizations, and nonprofits who make this our life. And we have to find ways to make sure the flows keep going and that we understand the increasing needs, right? The challenge is the world has significantly changed over the last 20 years, from everything from the environmental disasters and the changing climate patterns that create more natural disasters to the growing number of conflicts. Really, if you can look on the websites there, you'll see that the number of conflicts, there's only almost 1 in 7 countries is experiencing some kind of conflict. We have to understand the world has changed and allocate more resources towards this. I do think people need to understand on the media side too. In my decades of experience in international affairs, I'm sure you've seen this, Ara. In the old days, a journalist was a neutral observer, right? Of course, for some regimes that wasn't true. If you were in the Soviet Union or North Korea or a hostile environment, you had to worry about the government, but you didn't worry about the populations. Now media actually is being used by these polarized dynamics that are happening in all of our countries as a picking side somehow, right? And we have to also work. I think a bigger issue is working on this, lessening the polarization that's happening, because these issues get politicized back in our home countries. And once they get politicized, it's hard to raise money, right, for the humanitarian organizations, because if one half are saying, whatever the politicalization of this issue is, you lose half of your donors. We found in some of these issues that start becoming politicized, if that makes sense.
Yep, unfortunately it does. Well, thank you so much for still, trying and fighting the good fight for those who are in need. Haya, what are your thoughts on this?
I think it's very unfortunate that we reached a point where Syria stopped making headlines, although the situation did not get any better. But I think we have been really affected by what happened in Ukraine. However, we at the association at SACD have written a lot of articles explaining how had the international community listened to our warnings in Syria, we wouldn't have seen the situation that it is right now in Ukraine, because we warned a lot of times about the danger of leaving Russia unleashed and with actions on how do you call it, not held accountable. And what we saw in Mariupol was very similar to what we have seen in Duma in Damascus suburbs. So yani, unfortunately, it's sad that Syria stopped making headlines. It actually surfaced back again a bit during the earthquake, but it was buried after that as later on. I think it's a responsibility of journalists, honestly, who really empathize with Syria and who really believe in the cause for the Syrian people, to keep on writing about Syria and to keep on talking about it, to keep on advocating for it. And the Syrian people themselves, who, by the way, I want to mention that in the past 12 years, I really learned a lesson that Syrian people have really held each other up in an incredible ways. And we have seen this as well in the earthquake. I don't know if you saw the convoys that arrived from Deir ez-Zor to Idlib. It was spectacular. Imagine a small city in eastern Syria was able to provide number of trucks more than the number of trucks the whole United Nations was able to provide. So I think that's also something to look at and to consider for us as Syrians, that we have to keep on supporting each other and we have to keep on advocating for our cause.
Arwa, if I could add to that, that's great comments. I also think we have to be wise enough to understand that it's not just, we're not operating in a neutral zone in the sense, which is on the social media question, for instance. The reality is, if we start flooding the zone on Syria and it starts to have any tone of the war and the Russians are connected to that, which is what you need to get international attention back on it, we will have an army of Russian trolls in the US feeding out a different narrative and a different story. So there's also a requirement for governments to understand and get a handle on that there is nefarious activity in this space, right? That is actually impacting humanitarian work and the lives and the saving of lives and children around the world. So it's we really do have to go a level deeper, in my mind, to really kind of address this, because I think it actually has really hurt us that there are these huge other forces at play that try to dampen down and muddy the message, because the message has to be clear and simple, right? Because once it gets confusing, people turn to a much more simpler message.
Yeah, very true. Well, thank you both so much for your thoughts. I've really enjoyed speaking and hearing from both of you. Really appreciate your time. To those of you who joined us, thank you. You can rewatch this on the Atlantic Council's website. And please do stay tuned to follow the events and publications by following the Atlantic Council's Twitter page and the Atlantic Council's Middle East initiatives. Again, thank you so much for spending time with us. I really do appreciate it. I'm sure, as everyone here knows, time is also one of the more precious things that, we have to give. And all of us who feel so passionately about Syria and other humanitarian causes do appreciate spending this afternoon with you. And remember, you can also rewatch this on the website if I didn't say that before, or feel free to share the link on your social medias. Thank you so much, and goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.